Okay, so we're live. Hey family, this is African Esquire and I'm here with a new video. So this is going to be a very dynamic conversation. As many of you know, there was a midterm election that happened last week and a lot of people were debating regarding whether or not Black people should have participated in that election. So this is basically going to be kind of a debate on different political views in regards to what happened in this recent election and how Black people going forward should look to actually gain power, if not in the election process, then outside of the election process. So before I get started, I just want everyone to go ahead and introduce themselves.
Well, we can go in particular order. My name is Greg Carr. I'm the first president of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. And every 2 weeks, I get a check from Howard University in Washington, D.C., where I am the chairman of the Department of Afro-American Studies. Thank you for the invitation to participate tonight.
All right, well.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Kamal Rashid. I'm an associate professor at National Louis University in Chicago. I'm also a member of the Kemetic Institute of Chicago. I'm the Education Commission Chair for the Midwest region for the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. Again, thank you very much. Glad to be here
tonight. Hey, everybody. My name is Zach Brooks, son of Malcolm on Twitter. I'm a first-year PhD candidate at Temple University, Department of Africology. And, you know, I'm a regular on the show, so this is the third episode. So,
peace to the fam. My name is Omawale Africa. I'm a co-host of Revolution Live. As you all know, I'm an organizer here in Philadelphia. I currently serve as a treasurer for an organization called Afrocentricity International. I'm also the former president of the UNIA and ACL International Headquarters located in Philadelphia. I get a paycheck every 2 weeks from my work as a licensed CPA, but other than that, my work is really in the community with our people.
Peace, family. My name is Coloma. One more. No worries. Coloma Cardwell here from Philadelphia, but now living in New York as of the last 4 years. I'm an attorney and an organizer. I'm also the former co-chair of civil rights at the Metropolitan Black Bar Association here in New York. And look forward to having a very vibrant conversation.
How y'all doing? My name is Jeffrey. I'm currently a student at University of Buffalo, finishing up a bachelor's degree in English, and my minor is African American Studies. My Twitter is Drapesomaniac4, so I was invited by some friends. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
All right, so let's jump right in. We have a lot of participants, so we want to make sure we can hit all these questions that we have. So this past week was the midterm election. What are your thoughts on the midterm election that just passed, and what are your thoughts on the Black vote in general? Anyone can jump in.
Well, I'll start if nobody else, wants to start. Maybe we should have set an order prior to starting. But basically, my thoughts on this past midterm election, it's twofold. Actually, there was some silver lining in the midterm election for me. As you all know, I took an abstinence perspective, meaning I encouraged a lot of Black people not to vote or not to participate in the electoral process. So for me, the fact that there was so much kind of like put in to try to access the Black vote, with the amount of entertainers, the amount of celebrities that went to these these big races in like Florida and Georgia, in places like that, and the Black people still didn't turn out. I felt that was somewhat of a win for us, because I feel as though it's increasing the value of the Black vote. Meaning you can no longer just give Black people, concerts and free chicken wings and get our vote if there's nothing on a political platform for us. And then my second perspective is, in terms of voting in general, my politics are typically organized around the issue of Black survival. So with that in mind, it's my basic premise that this government from the federal, state, and local level is organized with the goal of removing its Black population. So in that regard, I don't believe that electoral politics is an effective mechanism or instrument to prevent that. So I believe that our organizing needs to be a bit more radical and grassroots outside of these institutions that are in place to uphold white supremacy.
So I think I appreciate the question. I think the election illustrated several things for me. One, it demonstrates the continued bankruptcy of this illusion of democracy, of this illusion of American democracy, particularly given the various scandals which have come out from Georgia and elsewhere. If you know these reports about voting machines not being inoperable, or you had voting facilities. I saw one report of voting facilities in Detroit where there were no machines. And so despite this idea that we live in a society that's based on this idea of political democracy, it would appear that that is more rhetorical than actual. And so again, American democracy continues to be bankrupt. I think it also illustrates the extent to which certain political interests in this country are willing to avail themselves of all means of underhanded schemes in order to hold on to power. And ultimately, what I think this represents is that the United States is a society that, as ever, is situated within the context of a crisis of legitimacy, or some might refer to it as a legitimation crisis. And I think that legitimation crisis may be an interesting opportunity for those who are politically astute and who are advocates of African self-determination. I do think that the grassroots capacity, which is brought to bear around the country, around mobilizing people to vote, is a capacity that can be purposed for a range of things. And I think this is one of the key possibilities that we should seize upon. And we can talk more about this later on, meaning how can we marshal this type of grassroots capacity relative to people's ongoing engagement and efforts around community development, political transformation. Now, I don't mean political just in terms of voting. Two other things. One, in terms of where I am in Illinois, we had the governor's election. We won, I think he was a billionaire lost and another billionaire won. And so we clearly live under a plutocracy. And I think that raises some interesting implications. And all of this is juxtaposed to the upcoming election next year for the mayor, which a lot of us are waiting for with bated breath. And the point is that what I think this illustrates as ever is the capacity of us to use these as opportunities by which you can have people to have critical conversations about not only the future of African people, but the future of the society and our particular vision of a society and how we can bring that to bear. And I'll elaborate on that a little more later.
Was anyone disappointed with the results of the election? I mean, I know there was governor elections where there's 2 Black candidates and a lot of people came out and supported them. Roland Martin kind of put the blame on the Black community for not going out and voting. Was anyone disappointed with what happened on last Tuesday?
I don't see where any rational person of African descent would be disappointed. But I will say this. The United States of America has always existed as an imaginary entity. As Dr. John Clark used to say, it's really not a nation. It's a multinational kind of settler state. People are competing. With that in mind, its dissolution, if we look at history, is all but inevitable. Recent article in Harper's Magazine said that, and it's nothing new, that by the middle of this century, somewhere near 70% of the people who live in this country are going to live in 15 states. So really it's a question of federalism for me. Will the United States federal entity interfere with self-determination at the local and state level? We know the answer to that is yes. Now, what does that mean for Tuesday? Well, there were several attorneys general, for example, elected in this country, one in Illinois, Minnesota, New York State, among others. Attorneys general are very important for cats to get pinched for small crimes. When you start talking about the chief law enforcement officer in a state, and I'm not talking about, these aren't revolutionaries. I mean, Letitia James in New York or, Keith Ellison in Minnesota, they're not revolutionaries. But when I think about exercising the vote as simply a tool or a weapon, not in advance in promoting some conceptual notion of the nation or dealing with sovereignty, but as one among countless numbers of tools to exercise when we're trying to do something toward our own liberation, given the fact that we're having this conversation in English, and when the United States of America, which should be the deepest irony, make anybody pause to start talking about sovereignty, we have to be intelligent in how we exercise all of our tools. Now, I'll say this and be quiet on it for initially. I wasn't disappointed on Tuesday. I think we get involved in what Dr. Clark calls showbiz politics. would I prefer Stacey Abrams to win in Georgia? And of course, that election still seems like it's being contested. Or young Gillum in Florida? Sure. But while we're looking at those marquee lineups, what we're not necessarily paying attention on is the young people of African descent who have been elected to the United States Congress on the federal level, 2 Native Americans going to the United States Congress, 2 Muslims, including a Afro-Palestinian sister out of Detroit who's taking John Conyers' seat. And then on the local level, we're talking about people who can enable that type of move towards sovereignty. And then we can talk more about that later. So no, disappointed, no. But I think that when we don't vote, we are in fact voting, because that's 1 vote less for whatever we're trying to advance and another vote in the column of our open white supremacist enemies.
I'll say that I was disappointed, and perhaps I shouldn't have been, but aside from being frustrated with the electoral outcomes, I was disappointed in the language that followed. And so I do think we're in a moment where the political landscape is fundamentally different than where it's been perhaps a few years ago, perhaps 10 years ago. You look at the rise of fascism that is taking place outside of the United States. You look at the forced migration that continues to happen at a scale that is really unprecedented in a lot of ways. You look at scientists telling us we have 10 or so years in order to get this climate catastrophe under effect. And the language continues to be, oh, couple thousand votes weren't accounted for. The language continues to be, oh, who's going to win? Is it going to be the Republicans or the Democrats? We're talking about a level of racial oppression that is going to have a ripple effect and touch almost every human being on the face of this earth. And I don't think our language has caught up to the crisis that we're currently living
in. Yeah.
Okay, I do want to. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, one of the things that I just kind of wanted to touch on is like I kind of wanted to agree with the idea that, you know, why should we be disappointed? And I think where I would like to start is that, you know, I think we should be looking at the United States as somebody who colonizes African people, as opposed to, you know, an entity that we participate within or exercise power or agency within. And I think like a lot of the time, because we put all our marbles in America's basket and we put our faith in that, that's where we're let down when what we think we invested in doesn't happen for us. Even when what we vote for doesn't get reflected in the policies of the people that we voted for when they actually exercise their power. So, yeah, so, I mean, I think there is a level of apathy, and I also do think there's disappointment, but I think there's only disappointment for people who are invested in the American project. And I think because of the splintering of America, I think this is one of those unique opportunities in history where, you know, there may be a potential for African political self-determination. You know, I mean, when I look at, you know, I'm just thinking about self-determination in the past across the African continent. Those are a direct result of World War II, you know? So to me, you know, when these, you know, when the Democrats and the Republicans are fighting each other and there's this splintering of ideas and this factionalism amongst these white people, a lot of the time we shouldn't pick sides of that fight. We should try to find ways to pick our own side. So, you know, I mean, I understand that, you know, maybe voting may be one tool of many, but I also think for many people, it's still an investment within that fight between 2 different sides. And I think it's hard for us to find our own interest within those people's fights, because we haven't really had clarity on who we are without them. Yeah.
I guess I'm just wondering, what is our interest as people who are living within the most powerful government in the world? What's our obligation to our neighbors, to our elders, to our children, to the unborn children? What's our obligation to those outside of this country? And so, you know, for me, the two sides thinking doesn't quite capture how we are particularly situated in this moment in human history. And on the one hand, it's deeply frustrating, it's deeply disappointing. On the other hand, is deeply encouraging. As someone who thinks part of the purpose of life is to serve yourself, so serve those who came before you, serve those who came after you. To me, there's an excitement that comes with being in the place where if you do find a way to rearrange some of the structures within your own country, you can definitively say you made a material difference in lives and countless numbers of folks.
Okay, so let's go to the next question. The next question is, can the Black vote be used as a collective instrument to influence national politics in the interest of Black people? My answer is it can, because in particular situations, it actually has been used. However, the first thing to me is that we first have to be organized. And you can't really be organized without a economic base inside of the United States. That's really how politics works in the United States. I always question people who advocate politics before advocating economic liberation first. And so if you are organized, if you do have an economic base and you're organized behind a philosophy, I do think that you can actually collectively use it as an instrument inside of national politics. The biggest example to me of when this did happen was during the anti-apartheid movement. You did see the Black community actually be able to organize and actually affect the anti-apartheid movement. So I think under certain circumstances, we know that we can. However, in this Democrat versus Republican sphere that we're kind of given, I don't see any way that we can influence within this these abstract categories of people of color. I don't think how we can actually influence our actual communities. So anyone would respond to that?
I would like to, and I would hate to do this, but I would like to. I think it's. I kind of disagree. I don't think that the Black vote has ever been used on a national level to influence national politics on the behalf of Black people. I think that when you bring up the apartheid issue, like you're conflating two things. Like you're conflating grassroots activism with actual like electoral politics. Like there was no vote that Black people cast a ballot in on the behalf of ending apartheid. However, I think that we did.
There were sanctions that were ordered and by the United States government because of the grassroots action that happened.
So
for that. So.
Because I still want to answer the question, but yes, I think that we did exert pressure on this system as a result of like the grassroots activity. But that's not to say that like as a result of us casting some type of vote, it influenced politics in the interest of Black people. Now, in terms of me answering that question, my answer is going to be no, because we don't have the numbers to do it, right? If you look at this, the 2016 national election, for example, non-white people consisted of about 27% of the national vote, and of that percentage, Black people only represented roughly 12% of that number. So in order for Black people to exercise some type of influence on national politics, the only way for us to do it would be through some type of multicultural or multi-racial alliance. And in doing that, it would have to be within one of the two national parties, either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And both of those parties have as their base white races, essentially. So it's not possible for you to put anything on the platform, on a Democratic or Republican platform, that speaks to the plight of Black people without alienating that white base. And I think the Democratic Party and the Republican Party both fear that, which is why you see under Democratic presidents, right, you'll see them putting forth policy to try to gain some of that base back that they lost to the Republicans. Like you see, the Clintons putting forth welfare reform, or like the crime bill. These are things to show that they can be tough on Black people or the inner cities to try to get that conservative white vote. So I don't think it's possible for us to influence the national vote in our favor.
I think history shows us that we have in fact influenced American policy. The anti-apartheid movement you cite, for example, certainly some of the leading figures to try to leverage that kind of thrust, which was a lot of Black people, but a lot of non-Black people as well. Immediately comes to mind the late Ron Dellums, who just passed away. Ron Dellums, former mayor of Oakland, former congressman from California. coming out of that intellectual and political and cultural thrust of the Bay Area, the Black Panthers, all this getting involved in electoral politics and then leveraging that community work into electoral office, and then ultimately being one of the staunch anti-war congressmen during the 1970s and 80s. Now, did that stop U.S. militarism? No, it didn't. However, in the period from the late 60s through the 1980s, before Ronald Reagan got into office, what you see is the expansion of the social welfare safety net. That means a lot to an older woman or older brother or a young person who doesn't have health care, and we all pay taxes. And think about what Brother Coloma just said about practical issues. We can talk about the philosophical difference, and both parties are expressions of capital and finance capital, and all that's true. But at the end of the day, when you have elected officials who are representing the interests of African people that we share with other people, that's when you see people like Mickey Leland coming out of Texas in the national legislature, or Barbara Jordan coming out of Texas in the national legislature, or come across the country to Alcee Hastings coming out of Florida in the national legislature. These are not Black nationalists. However, when Stacey Abrams, running for governor of Georgia, tells some poor white woman with no teeth, if you paid somebody $1 and they gave you 9 back, would you want that? And that white woman says, yeah, well, that's what's called Medicare expansion. I think that means a whole lot to a grandmother whose granddaughter is learning funga, alafia, ashe in an African-centered institution in Atlanta, but a grandmother doesn't have the ability to take care of her diabetes. You see, we have to be practical now. And that requires us to be much more sophisticated about how we think about the relationship of race to class. And that's going to be something that we can drive out of African communities, often with nationalist philosophy. But in order to make it effective and influential, finally, we have to then build bridges to other people, not become Uncle Toms, but allow them to see that our shared interests can allow us, as Booker T. Washington said, to be as separate as the fingers in social policy. But politically, I think we have to be a little bit more sophisticated to be able to have more influence. And history shows us we've had influence in the past.
And I'll just add to that and say that a number of political outcomes are, yes, tied to electoral outcomes, yes, tied to voting percentages, but they're also tied to narratives that grow and capture people's imagination.
Brother Coloma, I don't know if anyone else can hear it, but your speaker is coming through really bad. I don't know if it's just me.
Yes, me too.
Is this any better?
No, it's still very staticky.
It might be a connection. Sometimes if you log out and then log back in, it will come back better.
Yeah, that's what I did.
I'll try that.
Okay. I do want to ask a follow-up question. Do we think that in a similar way as to how Israel is basically upheld by American Jews in the United States, could Africans in America play a similar role for Africans on the continent as far as being a lobby if we were to ever try to organize politically?
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if I was to give it a crack, I would say no, it doesn't work the same way, because this is how racism functions. Black people are repressed in ways that other people are not. So when we consolidate power, we become targets of repression. So the thing is, and that's why a lot of the time, I think a lot of the ideas of using bureaucracies that exist within the United States or America or the state level or whichever, and trying to hijack them for Black interests, it seems unrealistic to me, because it seems like it's neglecting how racism works. Because I don't think people often want to acknowledge the realities of repression for politics that are potently for African interests or Black people's interests, whether they're here or abroad. So I would say I don't see that being realistic. And that's why I think a lot of the time people take such radical stances about how it is that we should interrelate with other Black people and what position we should take to other people. So when we talk about systems, we have to say systems are comprised of people. You know, we can't just say vote people into a system. We have to say who is the system, you know?
You know, it's interesting.
Okay, anyone else before we move on?
I'll just say very quickly, 1955, Adam Clayton Powell went to the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, the so-called Afro-Asian Summit. He went there not only representing part of like kind of a Black American thrust, but he also went there to protect the interests of the United States, meaning he kind of was at cross purposes. And this is a guy who was Malcolm X's friend. You know, by the middle of the next decade, when Malcolm goes to the OAU meeting and comes back with the idea for the OAAU, he's thinking in a Pan-African fashion, which is a little bit different than his friend in electoral politics. Let's skip forward 10 more years. By then, Charles Diggs and a handful of others, there's more than Adam Clayton Powell in Congress, and they found the Congressional Black Caucus. Charles Diggs' lead staffer was a man named Randall Robinson. Randall Robinson worked on Africa policy. That's where Trans-Africa came out of the Congressional Black Caucus, really, in his work. Now, that ends up being compromised in some ways. Donald Payne, congressman from New Jersey, Andrew Young, at one time congressman from Georgia, becomes the mayor of Georgia, Atlanta, starts talking about international capital and finance that improve Black entrepreneurial opportunities in Africa, and we get sidetracked. Last thing I'll say is that Charlie Cobb, who worked in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, people like Donna Moses, who's now Marimba Ani, Bob Moses, and others, you know, all those Africans went to Africa after SNCC's work in '64. And what he said is, you see an international bourgeois, an international Black bourgeois. So when we start talking about African policy, finally, and electoral politics in America, we have to understand that the elected officials, most of the time, work on the benefit of the Black elites. And that requires us then to change the way we even look at how we access electoral politics and play on an international scale. And I do think that we can use those politics for our advantage. But the first thing we're going to have to do is probably listen to the people who are doing the living and dying in our communities and look at the history of where we have made mistakes and where we've had successes, instead of just engaging in a theoretical analysis and then trying to start from scratch over and over again, because that's not what our open enemies do.
Can I just reply really quick to your initial question, Sister African Esquire? I don't believe that it's possible for Black people to essentially hijack the state institution or some type of like state capture to influence politics internationally on the behalf of African people. I believe that this society or this system is too resistant to that occurring. I think that has been a strategy that over the past 100 years that we have tried to basically like implement to gain that type of like influence. The second point I'd like to raise is, you know, Dr. Carr brought up Adam Clayton Powell in the Bandung Conference in 1955. We have to remember that when Adam Clayton Powell got to the conference, he wasn't received well by, you know, the Africans on the continent there. He was received basically as an Uncle Tom that was there to work in the interests of the American empire. So I think that we have to keep that in mind. This empire has a way of basically providing itself with a continued supply of those types of Africans who will work in its interests. So
I just want to interject. I think that with respect to the question, because I think it is an important question, and I think that African people can exert, I think that we have the capacity to utilize our political engagement, and by that I'm referring to voting as well as other tactics beyond voting to influence policy on the national level. But I think to a large extent, our success in that domain would in many ways be predicated on the extent to which we can effectively ally our interests to others' interests as well. I think that would augment our capacity in that respect. The context which immediately come to mind is a lot of the stuff that's happening right now around environmental policy. And again, this becomes an arena where there are many people who are adversely affected by, you know, the corporatist political structure of the United States, and have been able to throw that light in with others who are similarly ill affected. And so I think that capacity is real, but I think our ability to effectively leverage that assumes a high level of grassroots organization, much like what the AAPRP advocates, that all Black people belong to organization and be engaged and work in the community. So I think that's an element, a precondition that would have to be satisfied, but also that a high level of political education have occurred in our community, which again is an ongoing dilemma.
Now, I would agree. Let me just add very quickly. California is joined a number of other states in signing on to the Paris Climate Accords. Now, Brother Coloma, you know, he's made a point that's very important. We're Africans, so we understand that this ball is going to survive whether we're here or not. They'll just wipe humanity off. Climate change is real, and it's imminent. We're in imminent danger. You know, if California weren't in control of the politicians that are currently running it, they may not have done that. Now, is it Democrat, Republican? Yeah, that's the gloss. But we have to look beneath that to look at the politics of the people who are in elective office. Say Andrew Gillum became the governor, he's mayor of Tallahassee, governor of Florida. That doesn't flip the legislature in Florida, but it may and it would increase the leverage that we would have in Florida to push toward the type of environmental policies that we need. And that includes sister cities. That includes states at the state entity. It isn't just the federal entity. And ultimately, as you said, Kamal, when you start seeing countries become very nervous about their citizens forming linkages to other people, that's when you get concessions. I mean, obviously, Brown versus Board of Education, everything else that some people celebrate would not have been conceded had not Africans like Paul Robeson, S.E. Robeson, W.B. Du Bois, Shirley Graham Du Bois, William Patterson, Louise Thompson Patterson, and others gone to the United Nations to argue that the United States was creating genocide on African people. And you're right, Brother Wale. That's why I mentioned what happened in the 60s and 70s in the wake of Adam Clayton Powell's attempt. You know, when they went to the United Nations, Ralph Bunche is on the other side. But we're not talking about individuals in terms of politics. We're talking about the capacity to understand that politics is a weapon that has to be used on multiple fronts, and we should not abandon or concede any weapon in that struggle. And that includes deploying the vote when it is necessary to advance our interests.
And I would add, please let me know if you can't hear me. I would add that politics is also just not a reflection of policy. It's also a reflection of narratives. And so what Dr. Carr was just speaking to is, how do we find a way to disrupt narratives that have been deemed legitimate, that the vast majority of people know is that they're not? And so if you think back to the 2008 election and Barack Obama's on stage being questioned, and one of this question that constantly comes up between the Democrats and the Republicans is, what is the role of government? But what didn't come up is this question of what is the role of corporations in our society? And what California is doing with some of the legislation that's coming out, they're challenging narratives around what is the role of corporations going to be in a society in which we all have to breathe the air that corporations can impact, in a society in which we all have to drink the water that corporations can impact. And the political landscape might be that we cannot gain control over policy outcomes within the next 2 to 5, 10, 15 years, but there is a danger to allowing a false counter narrative gaining a foothold in the consciousness of the vast majority of people on this earth on these questions of what is the role of corporations, what is the role of government, how do we begin to shift what people are telling us is appropriate when our everyday lived experiences are telling us that it's not.
African Esquire, if I can just can I get a 20-second reply just really quick?
20 seconds, go ahead.
Cool. Because I started at the beginning by just saying that my politics are organized around the issue of Black survival, right? So when you're talking about water level rises and environmental things, I think that as an African-centered person, we all have to be concerned with the environment. But we have to understand that the number one threat to the global environment is white supremacy. Right, the white man, if you want to look throughout history, has basically showed us throughout his history that he exists outside of harmony, not just with his fellow mankind, but also with nature. So in order for us to do something about the situation, we're not going to be able to do it or change it through the institutions that he has set up in order to continue to perpetuate his dominance all across this globe. So when a brother mentioned the UN, one of the things that I want us to keep in mind is that the UN is not even an effective tool for us. It's also their tool. We have to remember that our ancestors went to the UN back in the 40s with the We Charge Genocide, with people like Du Bois, Queen Mother Moore, William Patterson. They all went to the UN and laid out, I think, like a document showing that the United States has a plan that's working at the federal, state, and local levels to basically eliminate its Black population. So this idea of going to the UN, just like voting, like it's a good organizing principle. It's a way to organize the masses. But in terms of it being something that can actually give us redress or alleviate our situation, I think that that's a moot point, and I think that history has showed us that.
Okay, let me give you one specific counterexample, and you can disagree as to the value of it on some of these macro questions, but take Philadelphia and Larry Krasner, for example. Take the fact that Black people voted Larry Krasner in. Now, you cannot tell me that on issues related to criminal justice reform, on issues related to how criminality is often emphasized in the media and racialized in the media, that it's irrelevant as to whether you have a district attorney who is withholding evidence up until a day before trial or not. You can't tell me it's not relevant to some of those other questions, whether you have a district attorney who is saying XYZ offenses shouldn't even be on my desk, and therefore we're removing them. You can't tell me that it's not relevant to have a DA in some of these systems who are saying, you know what, we actually have corrupt law enforcement agents.
It's 100% not relevant when you look at here. First of all, we look at the issue of criminal justice reform. It's an issue that the Democrats put on their platform back in 2008, and it's one of those what I refer to as like those lift all boats policies. It's a way to put a policy on the platform and you try to make it about Black people, but it's really not specifically about Black people. When you talk about Krasner in Philadelphia, well, right now, and I have friends who are organizing on the behalf of Mumia Abu Jamal, and they can't get the documents released from Krasner's DA office. So don't talk to me about. I mean, and I'm not being. I'm not. I'm gonna taper back a little.
I'm from Philly. I'm gonna handle it. You good?
We're both from Philly, so Philly it gets a little hot. But what I'm saying is, what you see with criminal justice reform, this is something that the Democrats are pushing heavy, and they have celebrity endorsements. They have the gentleman who gave all that money to Harvard to get the Harvard University named after him. They have big money and big foundations behind this whole criminal justice reform plan. This is nothing new, but in terms of how that impacts us day to day on the ground. You mentioned earlier in the panel discussion that where we are currently situated at this point in our life or whatever. The reality is economically, right? And this is things that these are things that people like Carter G. Woodson was talking about back in 1933, right? Economically, society on a global level is undergoing economic adjustment, right? So we're moving away from manual labor. We're getting more into an automated economy. We're getting more into an economy that's driven by artificial intelligence. So what this means is that standard labor, like people getting jobs, like this is something that is a thing like of the past. So the politics in this type of new situation is changing. So when you're talking about criminal justice reform, it means nothing to the issue of Black survival.
Hold up. Okay, so let me cut you off real quick.
I'm sorry.
Can you admit that there's things that have been done to the Black community from national politics or even politics in general? So we're talking about criminal justice reform. We know that didn't just happen. It hasn't been a problem that's always existed. Of course, the war on drugs was created by Reagan, and it was exacerbated by Clinton, and it was a 1994 crime bill. So I understand what you're saying, but I'm trying to see, do you think that the crime bill can be undone in any way, or you're saying that it can never be undone?
Can I jump in?
I mean,
either.
Are you asking me the question? I mean, for me, if you look at the crime bill and it's like it's real, implications for what it done to our community, like it's another form of slavery. So I mean, yeah, they signed emancipation before, right? I mean, the country has gone through not only one Reconstruction period, it went through a second Reconstruction period. And I would argue that right now, either we're at the beginning of a Reconstruction or we're nearly approaching one very soon. My argument is, what do we do during this period of Reconstruction? Do we just do what we did over the last 100, 150 years and just say, well, let's vote and get into these offices to change things? Like, no, we don't do that, because the reality—
That's not what I'm saying. Fundamentally, can those things be undone? And I understand the whole new Jim Crow thing, and I completely—
Let's be very specific when it comes to this. There were 3 states that had ballot measures to decriminalize or make legal various use of marijuana last Tuesday. One of the states voted, I guess it was Michigan, to make it legal for recreational use. 2 states made it legal for medicinal purposes. I'm with you, brother. I lived in Philly for 17 years. When we had Abu Jamal, absolutely. That is something we take completely to the wall. Is Krasner playing politics? Of course he is. But let's just go to what Coloma said. While we're working to free Mumia and all political prisoners, I think that whether or not he is prosecuting through the district attorney's office so-called quality of life or low-level crimes like getting caught with weed makes a whole lot of difference to many of the people who are probably watching this YouTube video right now. We have to be sophisticated now. We can't, you know, now here's what I would say. Let's say that a ballot initiative was introduced in Pennsylvania to make recreational use of marijuana legal. And let's say that people say, I'm not going to vote. All right, now that has real world consequences. Now the Clintons, we know, are not our friends. We know that that federal crime bill created real problems, and that that Bill Clinton initiated the so-called modern Democratic Party, the one that Barack Obama used, in part because he betrayed the thrust of the so-called Rainbow Coalition, not of Jesse Jackson, but of Jesse Jackson in conversation with an independent black political thrust that began in Gary in 1972. So we know who Bill Clinton is. But on the local level, on the level right now where somebody's getting grabbed up by a cop because he smelled something or didn't smell something, made up probable cause and pinched them, I think it makes a whole lot of difference whether or not you can vote in a referendum to decriminalize the use of marijuana. That's just my opinion.
Okay. Anyone want to respond, or should I move on?
Yeah, let's go to the next question.
All right, so next question is, are there gains that can be achieved by voting at the local level? And if so, can they be sustained over time? I primarily advocate local voting. I think that the real travesty with how, were you talking? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you skipped the question.
Oh, my bad. Let me go back. Can the black political bargaining power be used outside of the two-party system, i.e. forming a black political party, or can a black voting bloc only be exercised through one of the two national parties? Anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to speak to that because this goes back to some of the remarks that I said early on. I think that we can problematize the question itself. I think it's an important question, but I would argue we can problematize at least the first part of that question. I think one thing that we can query is, can the two-party system facilitate any social change that is consistent with improving the quality of life of the people who reside in this country, right? Because we live in a state essentially that it's more of a plutocracy than a democracy in actuality. So I would argue that the two-party system is inherently bankrupt. But this is no surprise. It's not saying anything to say that, right? What I think it does illustrate, though, is the types of spaces that open up when we more fully embrace the reality of that. By that I mean this. I think that African people should, as Maulana Karenga writes, move to seize political power on every level. To that end, I think that the capacity of us to do this through our own political blocks, our own political party, is absolutely imperative. And the reason why I think that is so is because I think we do need political institutions that are unambiguously committed to a black nationalist project, to a project of African self-determination. And I think the very existence of entities like that to advance a very specific type of political agenda on behalf of African people is absolutely imperative. That said, I think our capacity to exert our own will through the auspices of let's say, a so-called third party would probably be most effective on the local level, on the grassroots level, things like city council, things like state rep. And again, these are not things like county level offices. And you look at what's happening in the Chicago metropolitan area, you have this significant demographic transition which is occurring in the south suburbs. These south suburban communities, which have basically become predominantly black in the last 15, 20 years. And so I think that our capacity to affect our will through the auspices of an independent political party is extremely important on the local level. I think that the national two parties also, again, I think this is a dynamic that on the local level could probably be bent more effectively to the will of African people. I think the national piece is more of a problem, again, for everything that's been said before. And just to reiterate that real quick, I think the capacity of us to assert our will with respect to the two corporatist parties on the national level will be predicated upon the extent to which we have high levels of local political organization. Again, we're talking about an organizational capacity which does not exist in our community, a type of political capacity that has not been effectively marshaled in this country, probably at least since the early 1970s, on the national level as a whole. So my point is that I think that those two parties can be bent to the will of African people and others who are effectively allied with African people. But it takes a level of political organization that we've not seen in over a generation.
maybe even 2 generations, brother. I would say come out. When you look at 1972 Gary, and there hasn't been a whole lot of good work done on this, and we need to get some of that work from our elders like Conrad World and others who participated before they make transition. The notion of an independent party exists outside of the Democratic Republican American electoral politics structure. This is what Ron Walters writes about in his book Black Politics.
All good?
Yeah, that's what Ron Walters writes about in his book Black Presidential Politics in America, Pan-Africanism and the African Diaspora, analysis of modern movements, and it mirrors what happens in other countries. I think our goal at the federal level is to keep the feds out of our business and off our backs as this state fragments. That's why the judiciary is important. We should probably talk about that at some point, the federal judiciary, because that's how they're really gaming the system now to preserve white minority rule as the demographics change. But at the local and state level, when you see them meet at Gary in 1972, you've got Baraka, you've got Queen Mother Moore, you've got all them there, but you also have people like Coleman Young, who's a state senator coming out of the labor movement in Detroit, which, by the way, through Drum was a radical nationalist movement in many ways, hadn't yet become the mayor of Detroit. But ultimately, when they leave in 72 Gary, they're not talking about leaving the Democrats or the Republicans. They're really talking about forming an independent Black political party that can engage with whoever they need to engage to at those levels. Finally, what we see after 1972 in Gary is that organizing thrusts at the local level, whether it be called Stokes in Cleveland, whether it be, well, it's actually Stokes number before 72, Harold Washington being a great example in Chicago, you have Black nationalists who engage in the political process and through that are able to leverage some public resources at the local level to help advance exactly the kind of things that we want. That is an important use of politics in a sophisticated manner. The GOP probably won't exist much longer. It's probably going to go the way the Whigs did in the 1840s and 50s, because they are now appealing to strict white supremacy. As a result, it's going to dissolve. Now, the question becomes, which party apparatus do we leverage from our independent political base to be able to advance our interests? And right now, the Democratic Party gives you access to apparatus, and including corporate dollars, unfortunately, that we can use if we can hang on. The only other thing I'll say is this. They're not playing with this federal judiciary. When you read the Citizens United case, what John Robertson and them did by underscoring the idea of corporations as individuals who have protected speech in unlimited form, what they're doing is offshoring the idea of political participation to put it directly in the hands of corporate elites. And that makes Black independent politics not only that much more necessary, but that much more difficult outside of that two-party system when they're pumping in dollars by the billions to support whichever political party that takes the upper hand.
Any responses?
Yeah, we keep saying two-party system, which
Okay, brother, your mic's doing breakup again.
Goodness gracious. Is this any better?
No, we should probably log out and log back in.
All right, yeah, I logged out. I'm finally back.
Yeah, let Jeff said he wanted to say something. I got something to say on this too, but I want to hear Jeff first.
Y'all hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I agree with everything Dr. said. And we Black nationalists do have a history of participating. If we look at the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, that was a Black nationalist organization, and at enfranchising disenfranchised sharecroppers and things like that. But even if you look at antebellum times, like people like Henry Highland Garnett, they did participate in electoral politics to try to fight for integration institutions, and to lessen white racial domination in the North. So I think while I don't believe in a two-party system like that, I do believe that if there is contest for power, that we. So.
I went out.
Yeah.
But
can you hear me, sis? All right. So a lot has been said, and I kind of like want to address it, right? So I first want to start by addressing our brother Ndugu Kamal, Dr. Kamal Rashid, when he conceded to the point that at the national level there's nothing that can be done kind of like on that Democratic Republican side, but he said kind of like at the local level it can be wielded. So I want to address that first. if we look down at I think Jackson, Mississippi right now with the Malcolm X grassroots movement with Chokwe Lumumba's son, we see that he wanted to basically get that movement, right, or their ideas on the ballot. The only way to do that was to do it through the Democratic Party. And once you kind of insert yourself, right, plug yourself into that system, right, any revolutionary ideas that you thought you were going to exert via state capture, like it kind of like goes out the window. So right now you see a split happening within their party. You know, there's an article that was put on the Black Agenda Report where you got people in the party accusing the other side of the party of being what they were referred to as ultra leftists, right? Because they're saying like, hey, what happened to all these radical, you know, changes that we were looking to implement? You know, now we have the seats of power, and what are we doing with it, right? But to answer the question about a black voting bloc, Gunnar Myrdal wrote an American Dilemma. Is a section called The Negro's Political Bargaining Power. And he wrote 3 reasons why a black voting bloc could never be achieved in America to basically influence national politics. The first reason was lack of political sophistication. The second reason was reliance on white financiers, meaning we can't basically run a black candidate or a black platform with black money. We have to go to white people to get their money. And the third reason was what he referred to as political opportunists or sellouts. And in speaking to this third, he said, I'm quoting here, he said, there is also the tendency among many Negroes who aspire to prominence or who have arrived but want to make themselves secure to take orders from the influential whites and to sell out their own group. Such persons seem to be everywhere available for utilization and splitting up the unity of the Negroes. So when it comes to us operating like as a block within this system in order to gain power, there's too many people willing to make themselves useful to the system. Why? Because they'd rather be a king in somebody else's kingdom rather than working to build their own kingdom. So that's kind of like where I'm at with it.
Can I say something very quickly? Number one, Bruce Dixon's article in Black Agenda Report critiquing brother Akinyele Umoja was in December 2017, shortly after the election in Jackson. I think the jury is still out on what they can and can't do in Cooperation Jackson, given his very valid engagement and critique of brother Akinyele's position. Again, Jackson is a majority black city, and yeah, electoral capture. See, you know, when you pay taxes and live in a place, I don't like to think of it as somehow we're asking somebody for something. You know, I mean, but I hear what you're saying, and I do agree with it in terms of the compelling pull of the party and how it's very difficult to do that. I mean, I see Brother Antar, and I'm looking also at our brother in Newark, Mary Baraka's son, Ras, and you do have a difficult thing to leverage those resources. However, I'd prefer to have them in power than not have them in power. The other thing I'd say is Gunnar Myrdal, basically, who used the work of a number of black social scientists, including Frank Frazier, Ralph Bunche, and others, including Du Bois. His analysis in An American Dilemma is certainly, I think, colored by his inability to grapple with questions of culture and a deep understanding of black life in America. Now, I don't disagree with the idea that certainly that black elite will be compromised. We see that over and over again. However, what we also see is that when at the time Gunnar Myrdal was using Ralph Bunche's essays to craft what ends up being published as An American Dilemma, and it's very interesting, I think, when you read American Dilemma against what Ralph Bunche wrote, the 6 months that he generated thousands of pages of essay for Myrdal, what you see is that was a moment when E. Franklin Frazier and others, including Charles Hamilton Houston, ironically, the lawyer, began to look at socialism as a potential thing for black people to embrace. Now, fast forward to 2018. Is that going to be possible in 2018? I think there's a whole lot possible in this moment that may have been less possible in the mid-20th century, if for no other reason than we're reaching a stage of late capitalism where you can't sustain this much longer. And that in that moment of that kind of unsustainability, I think what we have the opportunity to do, and this includes using the vote, which is a small piece, but a vital piece, I think, in this, is to generate much more sophisticated analyses of late capitalism. And I'm talking about on the ground with regular folks that can allow us to ultimately create that type of leveraging of local resources. I really think we shouldn't rush past the lessons we should be learning if we do a deep study of every time we've tried to do this.
I think we really hit a lot of what we were saying about local voting. I don't know if anyone has anything to add. We can skip that question if anyone.
I'll just add one thing quickly, if you can hear me at all.
Yes.
I'll just add that, you know, I'm working with my tenants and neighbors right now to prevent a developer-driven rezoning of Central Harlem. And one of the things that myself and other organizers are learning is that people need practice believing that they have power, and people need practice wielding power. And so if we don't have people as a matter of daily practice and living engaged in local political fights and battles, this idea that they're magically going to get the national or international political question right, or that they're magically going to wield the national or international tool in a way that doesn't replicate harming themselves or other people, is something that I just struggle with. People need practice with everything from budgeting to organizing personnel across skill sets, across technological challenges, and the local level provides an opportunity for people to gain that practice.
Who elected Garvey? I'm saying, like, who elected Garvey? I agree people need practice wielding power, but I don't think politics is only within the realm of the existing bureaucratic institutions of the United States. And I think that's where self-determination comes in and organizing. You know, like, I think when we take ourselves seriously as a nation, then we don't have to elect people into positions to practice wielding power.
Okay, so if we're not going to recognize that electoral politics or that government itself is the way to prevent certain harms, how do you organize organizationally or at the community level to prevent corporations that are not bound by the nation state from polluting and poisoning water? If government isn't the mechanism to rein in corporations, for example, what is? It's not your local community group in any particular country. You actually need structures that can move as easily across national and international boundaries to the degree that the entities that are creating the problem. And so when we say politics or electoral representation is not the thing, then what is the thing? Because your local community cannot organize against some of these corporate forces that are structuring many of our lives.
So I think what's important about your question is the thing is, we know who's to blame for these kinds of problems. We know these corporations are to blame. But you know what? That's like saying France is destroying the world. How can we organize here in Haiti to stop France from doing these bad things that they're doing? Do you see what I'm saying? Like because we don't have power within the imperial nation, how are we to hold them accountable for what they do unless we disempower them, which is a question of war. Like, that's what I mean. Like, it's like, I don't know.
No. Don't leave that. Don't leave that. I mean, who elected Garvey? Nobody. I think we have to get past the binary thinking. It's not either or. It's all working together. When Garvey comes to the United States in 1916, there are no black elected officials. Ultimately, when he's deported from this country, locked up at the pen in 25 and sent out in 27, the federal prosecutor does that in Illinois. Now, does that say that there would a black federal prosecutor appointed would have been different? Maybe not. Probably not. In fact, the first FBI agent we have, Walter Loving, among others, infiltrated the Garvey movement in the military intelligence division. But let's fast forward. The cubs of Garvey that he talks about, by the time you get to Carlos Cooks in the 1950s and 60s, you have some black political power at the local level that begins to enable and give some cover protection for him. You come forward another generation, the Garvey movement still existing, the reparations conversation still being floated, and you begin to see, because of black political participation, some room to operate. The African-centered movement that has kept the idea of Garvey alive, part of that was as a direct result of local educational, at least some nominal control. Look in the city of Detroit. Kwame Kenyatta, elected to the Detroit School Board, they fight the African-centered curriculum argument in the 1990s. And you have Betsy DeVos on the other side, an ideologue, a rogue ideologue who wants to privatize public education, but you have a real split in the Black nationalist community that takes place between the Africans that want to take those public dollars for charter schools and create public charter schools, African-centered charter schools, and those that don't want to take the public dollars. That's something that still lingers today. So who elected Garvey? Nobody. But nobody ever elects organizers at the local level. You use politicians if we know how to use politicians, and that comes from a sophisticated network of organizing and study at the local level, where you use politicians the same way they use politicians. I don't like the narrative, to go back to something that Coloma said, these narratives of Black powerlessness. We can defeat these people, and we need to know that as we organize at the local level and leverage that to larger strengths.
I just, Dr. Carr and Brother Coloma, I just want to push back a little bit because, I think that the issue is, an issue of powerlessness. You know what I mean? And if we are truly concerned with the survival of our people, then we have to be about obtaining power. So if we're making the argument that, the way for us to essentially obtain or will power is to basically hijack these institutions that are put in place to maintain the dominance of a group that is openly opposed to us, and to basically eradicate us from their society. I don't think that that's a realistic thing that we should be trying to achieve, right? And then when you talk about gains at the local level, there are no gains at the local level that are sustainable. You talked about the expansion of the welfare state that came like in the late 60s going into the 70s. Well, if you look at what's the causality of that expansion, you never get any expansion, you never get any concessions without significant upheaval in the street.
Right.
The ancestor, Derek Bell talked about, we understood that we got our positions in the society as a result of the riots that happened, after Dr. King was killed, right? We got our positions in the society as a result of Watts, as a result of Philly, as a result of Harlem, as a result of Brooklyn. If you don't have that type of revolutionary pressure being exerted outside of the system, then there are no concessions to be gained. And we also know that this system is adept to course correct. So basically, okay,
refinement, exactly.
We'll give you a concession.
Where's the disagreement, brother?
In the 80s, we'll come and hit you with crack, and in the 90s, we'll hit you with mass incarceration because our game is always the same, right? And the most important thing is that when we look at why the concessions are given in our community, they're given to put the radical element on ice. And what do I mean by ice, right? To isolate, contain, and then ultimately eliminate, right? But okay, now we've iced that part of the community and the game is still rolling. They're still trying to get rid of us. And I'm saying that problem of powerlessness cannot be addressed through electoral politics. Like that's
where's the disagreement? Where's the disagreement, brother? I mean,
I just think
I don't hear the disagreement. I hear constructing a straw person and then attacking it. You living in Philly, I'm gonna tell you right now, as one of the founders of Sankofa Freedom Academy, public charter school, as a person who was around when Chris Wiggins was a middle school teacher over at Ada Lewis before there was an Imhotep public charter school, that elected officials matter when it comes time to get things like charters for African-centered public schools. I'm not talking about either or, brother. We don't put all our eggs in any one basket. So I guess, you got grassroots organizers, Maisha Ngoza and others, Aisha Imani, doing African-centered work going back to the 60s. I'm saying it's a full spectrum attack. And I guess what I'm trying to understand is, how is that being received as this kind of dichotomy? That's where I'm losing it.
Because
why abandon any piece in a collective thrust?
Let me just reply really quick. I think the reason, and this isn't necessarily a binary, as you called it earlier, but I think that the reason why it's being received as some type of dichotomy is because, back in '71, there was a symposium that Harold Cruz and Dr. Bobby Wright spoke on, and then Harold Cruz lectured on that symposium. He asked a fundamental question. Right, and the question was whether you was an integrationist, a separatist, a Pan-Africanist, a nationalist. The question became, do you think whatever it is that you want, right? Because a lot of us are confused on what we want because we don't have clarity. But whatever it is that you want, do you think it can be achieved within this system? Meaning, do you believe the system can be reformed? If the answer to that question is yes, well, then he said you have people that you can find a consensus with and work with. But if the answer to that question is no, and that's the argument that I'm putting forward, I don't believe that what I am looking to achieve, or what I see as liberation for Black people, can be achieved within this system. So as a result, I'm saying no, and I'm pivoting right away to the necessary steps to get to what I'm trying to get for Black people. And that doesn't come from voting. Actually participating in this system, it goes into direct opposition to what Black people need to get for themselves.
In some instances, it does. Go ahead, my brother. Jump in.
Yeah, I mean, all I wanted to say is, like, I think fundamentally what we're getting to the root of is the contradiction between, you know, integrationism, whether radical or moderate, or separation. And I think those two different directions simultaneously give Black people forms of political schizophrenia. And a lot of the time we're not able to organize ourselves in ways that are constructive because of those conceptual differences. Because what separatists want was fundamentally a separate nation for Black people. And what integrationists want is to continue to be an appendage to the white project. You know, and they say it's for the short term, but in the long term, that those moderacies, those moderates, they end up being the justification for refinement of the system of white supremacy. And that's why radicalism and moderacy aren't just degrees, they're opposites. And I think that's what we're getting at right now. I think that's the contention.
Well, I think we have, for me at least, I think we have a little bit of conceptual confusion. And so the definition that you just gave for integration, Martin Luther King would vehemently disagree with that if he were still alive. And so when he's pressing people and saying that integration and desegregation are not the same thing, he's pushing people to think beyond this idea that if we just merely are physically in proximity to each other, then we also magically have spiritual proximity or spiritual connectedness. And so even the language that we're using is often not capturing reality. So in 1954, Brown v. Board, some might say that began this integrationist period. I would say that the court spent the next 20 years doing everything they can to block integration. I would say that even to this very day, you look in housing, you look in education, especially public education, you have a number of spaces that are deeply segregated. And so part of what this back and forth is just about us trying to gain conceptual clarity, which is more than appropriate, but we have to either stop and ask ourselves or stop and ask each other when we use some of these loaded terms, what it is that you actually mean or referring to.
That's right.
I want to go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I mean, you mentioned Harold Cruz in 71 in Northeastern Illinois. The branch campus, by the way, that is now named for Jacob Carruthers in part because of Black political power on the South Side.
Sorry, I missed it.
Oh, anyway, I mean, a lot of people refer to Harold Cruz's 1967, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And I would point to his later book, Plural But Equal, and to underscore what Coloma is talking about. When you start talking about concepts like integration and segregation, separation in terms of the volitional act, making this self-decision, you know, it often belies or flies in the face of the lived reality of our people. Again, we're having this conversation in English. All of us have been through white institutions, even HBCUs with that structure, you know. And then we're talking about this notion of self-determination. You know, it's a multi-layered thing. It's actually kind of funny if we think about the deep ironies involved. But Cruz, in Plural But Equal, talks about the fact that you can engage in group politics from your cultural base. He references the Jewish community, for example, who are telling the NAACP that they should fight for quote-unquote integration in the 1920s and 30s while they are maintaining their independent cultural political institutions at the same time that they're integrating electoral politics and using politicians for their advance. I think Harold Cruz has a lot to teach us, but I think it requires us to read Harold Cruz and read him deeply and then apply our study to the times in the past that we have made advances. This isn't a paradigm of integration or separation. As Coloma said, we're more segregated now than we were before the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, in terms of the spatial segregation, in terms of class segregation, all these things. But we continue to talk about things in the abstract, and I don't think we spend enough time studying how we have made advances in spite of those things. And so what ends up happening is we end up talking about things that have very little relevance or meaning or bearing to the lived reality of our people.
I mean, I think Marie Melanie would fundamentally disagree with Harold Cruz's idea of culture. Like, and that's what I mean. Like if our culture isn't politicized, then what are we doing? We can't politicize our culture as African people while assimilating into the American project. That's
let me just ask you a quick question. I want to be clear. Because Cruz's argument in Crisis is that our crisis is a cultural crisis. When you say Marimba would disagree, what do you mean?
So what I mean is what she sees as a politicization of our culture isn't just I think she has a more enhanced and in fact a more African idea of what our culture is for us to get
agree with that. Sure.
More to the root of it.
So, with Cruz. Yeah.
You know, I hear you. But I think what I'm saying is what I think is I think culture is, how should I say? I want to find the right words, but I don't have the right words in the moment.
Okay.
All right, sorry about that.
Wrap that point up, and then we'll go to I think Jeffrey wants to hit a point, and then we'll go Camo, and then Jeff. Okay, sorry.
So I just wanted to speak to a point that a question that was raised earlier, because I think it is an important question. The question was pertaining to sustainability. I think the sustainability question is absolutely real, and again, I have to emphasize the fact that we are not simply talking about a particular malaise that we as African people are dealing with in terms of attempting to sustain a political thrust that is consistent with advance in a different type of paradigmatic orientation of policy formation. I think this is actually something that characterizes many people who are disaffected by or many groups rather who are disaffected by the current by this system. So the sustainability question is real, but I think that we cannot underemphasize the educational. No, I think that we cannot underemphasize the importance of us working and thinking about this working in multidimensional ways. And I think that's part of the difficulty and the complexity of this conversation, because again, I agree with Dr. Carr. I think it's problematic to frame this in binary terms. We vote or we don't vote. I think that it's much more nuanced than that. And there are a couple of instances that come to mind when I think about this, because I think that we find many instances historically throughout the 20th century where African people have engaged in processes of political organization, where Black people have engaged in processes of participating in the process in electoral politics, while simultaneously engaging in very rich and very compelling levels of community institution building, grassroots organizing, and the like. In fact, I think that we see a number of instances, and you can look at the period from 54 to about 65, a period where this very mainstream integrationist movement championing social change through the legislature, through courts, as well as through voting, as a process which facilitated a much more radical form of Black movement from 65 on in the context of the Black Power movement. I think that there's a synergistic link between these. One of the things that the civil rights movement enabled, one of the ways it contributed to the formation, this deepening of the critical orientation of Black consciousness of Africans in these cities, particularly from 1965 to the early 1970s, was that the failure of the civil rights achievements, of the civil rights movement to fundamentally transform the reality of Africans living in Western and Northern cities emphasized the illegitimacy of the American social order. And so it in fact provided great fuel for the formation of nationalist formations, in addition to other quote unquote radical formations such as the Black Panther Party. And so I think that the political process, participating in the political process is important in a number of respects. And I think Brother Greg made this point in terms of our ability to access resources. And again, as somebody who's engaged in a whole range of community initiatives here, it's very clear to me that who's in the mayor's office, who's in the state legislature has a direct impact and direct impact in terms of a lot of what we're able to do locally. And so that piece can't be discounted. But at the same time, on the broader level, our inability or our limited capacity in this domain, I would argue, is also an effective tool which effectively can be used to transform and reorient the consciousness of many of our people who only see voting as the most effective mechanism or the singular mechanism through which we can affect our society. So again, we have to move multidimensionally. It's not an either or. We have to do both. And we also have to see this piece of how we participate in the political process as a mechanism of moving us toward our ultimate goal, which is sovereignty. Again, these are not things which are delinked. And I think Chokwe Lumumba understood that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I'm assuming when you say sovereignty, you don't mean sovereignty in the way that the people who are currently in control of the American government and economic system.
No, I'm talking about the vision of people like Garvey, and I would say specifically, I'm talking about the idea that emerged out of the new African independence movement. In fact, real quick, in the early 2000s, there was a brother who was elected as president of the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa named Demetri Marshall, Dr. Demetri Marshall. And Demetri Marshall laid out a very compelling plan because it consisted of three types of political strategies with respect to the location of African people. It was urban areas within the national territory being South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. So there was one particular strategy around Africans who were in cities within the national territory. There was another set of strategies for Africans who were in rural areas in the national territory. And there was a third strategy for Africans outside of the national territory. And it was very comprehensive in terms of how do we move from where we are at that point, this is 2001, 2002, when I got brought into this conversation, to a national plebiscite, and from there to a play for statehood. And so, no, I'm talking about net sovereignty with respect to this historic discourse coming from people like Malcolm X, obviously, and his impact on the new African independence movements. So that's the perspective that I'm coming from when I use that word. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Jeffrey, and we're going to go to the next question.
All right. So yeah, I agree that nobody elected Garvey, but somebody did appoint Martin Delaney as a trial justice. And, oftentimes, like, Reconstruction gets framed as Black people trying to integrate and things like that, but that's not necessarily true. You have plenty of, like, early Black nationalist politicians that were trying to campaign for the 40 acres and a mule and, the land that was promised to Black people through Special Field Order Number 15. So, just the dichotomy of this or that, it's kind of new, and it's not really something that, nationalists should adhere to. I think wherever we can try to gain power, Black nationalists need to be at the forefront to fight for our gains as a people. So, nationalism is not limited to nationhood. It's really based on peoplehood, us as a group within this country too.
Absolutely. I think that's where the work of the great Imari Obadele, his dissertation, written at Temple, becomes America the nation state, becomes very important. Kamal, you laid that out beautifully, brother, because and that really is where I would say at the national level, we have an issue with this question of federalism. The states' rights narrative, to use the word that Brother Coloma keeps introducing, which is very important, the narrative of states' rights being a bad thing, reading it through the 10th Amendment of the Federal Constitution, meaning that any power that's not in the federal government is reserved to the states. That's something that's been drilled in our heads, for a long time. But Imari understood that can be inverted, and this whole notion of plebiscite, this whole notion of sovereignty at the local and in the state level, that is more possible now. As I said, by the middle of this century, you got if 15 states are going to have 70% of the population, that means that 30% of the states are going to pick 70% of the senators. That is unsustainable. California and the East Coast states, but not just that. Mississippi, Texas, Alabama, Georgia. What we're seeing a gesture toward in electoral politics is the inevitability of a demographic transformation. There's a reason Chokwe and them moved to Mississippi. There's a reason Antar and Rukia and them are trying to do something with Jackson Rising. That's a foothold. Now, if Mike Ep3 is in a runoff with a clear white supremacist woman who's talking about going to public hangings, and if we say we're not going to vote, fine. If Mike Ep3 doesn't get in, this white supremacist woman is there for 6 years, fine. But I guarantee you 6 years from now, the demographics in Mississippi is going to look that much more different. And the possibilities of what Imari began to look at, what the provisional government of the Republic of New Africa began to imagine, it becomes more and more possible the farther we get in this American experiment. This nation state is going to dissolve. And so whether it be Pearl Clegg writing a play like Flying West about Nicodemus, Kansas, informed by the growing up in Detroit and in her father's church, the Shrine of the Black Madonna, Maybe it wasn't time for Nicodemus, Kansas. As you said, brother, during Reconstruction, when Pap Singleton and them move out there. Maybe it wasn't time for electoral politics in South Carolina when Mark Delaney runs afoul of some black people to say, brother, you're on the wrong side. Maybe it wasn't time then, but I guarantee you the time is coming when questions of black sovereignty and sustainability are quite possible. And what we have to do now is prepare for those times, educating our people, organizing, but not retreating from the dissolution of this federal state, because these white boys are going to try to keep the United States going at the federal level. And at that point, states' rights become something that I think we should probably consider embracing, because it's going to mean and lead to our eventual sovereignty in this space connected with other black spaces in the world.
Okay, so let's go to the next question. The question is there an alternative to obtaining black power outside of electoral politics? And if so, what does it look like? I know for me, what it looks like is Pan-Africanism, which can include black politics if there is actually an opportunity for that, or it can be outside of that if African people throughout the diaspora and on a continent are actually able to unite on agreeing on social platforms, agreeing on what a liberated Africa could look like. So I interpret Black power to be Pan-Africanism actually in effect, economic liberation through not just locally. We always talk about supporting Black businesses, but we don't talk about the issue of neo-colonialism on the continent. As long as the continent is enslaved under neo-colonialism, imperialism, I don't see any future of Black power for us in the United States. So to me, Black power looks like the continent being liberated and us in turn also being liberated here. Anyone have any contrary views?
Can I give you, just consistent with what you just said, this is very interesting because we got into this thing Friday, I guess, talking about Malcolm X and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ballad of the Bullet. The song that the Snick Singers performed the night that Malcolm X opened for Fannie Lou Hamer was a song written by Matthew Jones. I was fortunate enough to meet that brother before he made transition and asked him what was going through his mind when they wrote this song. It's called Oginga Odinga. Oginga Odinga, of course, in the government of Jomo Kenyatta is one of the people responsible for sending Barack Obama's father over here. But he had gone to Atlanta, and the white fathers of the city of Atlanta, the mayor and them, wanted to show this African around to show him how this is an integrated place and we're too busy to hate. Meanwhile, the SNCC students had done a sit-in. Now they're fighting for political rights in Georgia, in Atlanta. And so when he writes this song, Oginga Odinga, what Jones is doing, what SNCC is doing is saying that the struggles of African liberation movements are the struggles of Africans in this country as well. When Malcolm gets up after that song, he says, that's my favorite song y'all sing. And let me tell y'all why. And then he gives a whole lesson on Pan-Africanism and linking our struggles. Then he introduces Fannie Lou Hamer after going through a bunch of other political analysis. Why am I bringing this up? It is a multi-full spectrum struggle we have to engage in. And every time people in this country have looked outward, anytime Africans here have looked to Africans overseas, this country has gotten extremely nervous, particularly when you've seen political efforts expressed. This is how they've made those concessions you're talking about, Brother Omawale, to the Black elite, the Black middle class. And as Du Bois said, finally, in an essay he wrote in 1960 called Whither Now and Why, just before he left for Ghana a year later, what Du Bois says is, we're going to see these laws changed, and then we're going to have to answer the real question. Who are we going to be culturally? Who are we going to be racially? And that Pan-Africanism you're talking about, sister, that Pan-Africanism is then going to kick in. But we have to understand that we've always understood that. And we've never had this binary fighting either or. It's always been both and. And there's no more beautiful expression of that in this moment, I think, than Malcolm X with the SNCC Singers and Fannie Lou Hamer connecting all that work that night when he introduced Fannie Lou Hamer in New York.
Can I add? So I'd like to agree. I'd like to agree with Dr. Carr. I'd also like to address this question of the binary question. And one of the lectures that I had just watched again recently was a lecture on the Haitian Revolution by Ina Bello, and she was talking about how a lot of the time people try to pit Toussaint Louverture versus Jean-Jacques Dessalines because Toussaint fought against slavery. Dessalines fought for independence. Toussaint wanted Haiti to be part of the French Empire and reconsolidate whatever the remnants of the colonial structure was in Haiti, and Dessalines fundamentally wanted to be nothing to do with Haiti. And the way she contextualized it is, if you look at the revolution in Haiti outside of the context of voodoo, then you'll misunderstand. So when she said you can't pit Toussaint against Dessalines, because Toussaint, while he was wise and he knew he needed to partner with the British and partner with the French, opportunistically in order to engage what the larger fight was against slavery, that doesn't contradict Dessalines' position, which is that of Ogun, which is, the hard truths and pushing forward and, being more militantly in one direction. So, Toussaint's vision was wider, in that he knew how to strategically navigate, while he was more moderate, he still got what needed to be got done. And he opened the door for Dessalines to do what he needed to do in order to lead the path towards independence. And I look at Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey that way. But in many ways, I look at this conversation in that way, as to where, I think I could be an Ogun in many ways, where it's just, I'm kind of very straightforward in one direction, separatism, as to where, maybe like Dr. Carr and, Dr. Rashid, y'all kind of like give other, perspectives from people who may have disagreed, but has still done a lot of things to open up the way. So, I don't think that's a closing note, but I think it's a good way to contextualize why I don't think what we're saying is a binary, even though we are disagreeing on certain things. But I think disagreement is okay. I think plurality is okay within these kinds of conversations.
All right, so I gotta jump in here and be, I gotta be somewhat of a contrarian here, and I have to disagree with my brother and sister panelists that have gone before me. I'm going to say that, if the question is there an alternative to obtaining Black power outside of electoral politics? My answer becomes like, it's our only alternative. Electoral politics are not a means of obtaining Black power. There's a lot that I kind of like want to address here, but let me kind of like gather my thoughts. Dr. Carr, you mentioned that. First I want to deal with the Malcolm issue, because I conceded to you on Friday, but only because it was Twitter and the tone. I didn't want anyone to think that it was a disrespectful exchange between us. So I kind of humbled out of that.
Same here. No.
But when you look at the Malcolm situation, when he's introducing Fannie Lou Hamer, you have to remember, Malcolm told us that, he would speak on any platform as long as it's getting to a Black audience. Speaking on a platform is not evidence of endorsing the position of the platform. Now, when you look at the argument that he laid out before introducing Fannie Lou Hamer, right, he talked about, why he loves the song Odenga, Odenga. Then he talked about us needing a Mau Mau in Mississippi, in Harlem, which is a revolutionary outfit to fight against the current reality. But the way he lays up his argument is he basically says, hey, we need a revolutionary situation to change this reality in America. Then he explains the democratic reality in America. He says, hey, you got these committees that run things, and that's the Democratic Party. Those are your Democrats that you voted for, 97%. So he's laying up this argument to show the audience that, hey, this Democrat or this political machine that you're looking to go through to effectuate your liberation is not an effective tool or a mechanism to get what you want. And then he ends by saying, so you got to give people an alternative. You just can't say the ballot. It got to be either the ballot or the bullet. Well, he already answered your question when he told you that the ballot is not going to get you what you're looking for.
Wait, he said don't vote?
He said no, no, that's not what I'm saying.
No, he didn't say that.
Yeah, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that's what I'm saying.
Right, that's what you saying, but that's not what he said that night. Or
no. What I said was that, like, you are cleverly trying to now use him to support a voting position, and that's not what he was doing there. He made the argument that the ballot wasn't effective, and he made sure, I would like to conclude, and I'm going to repeat myself, that what you are looking for is never going to come through nonviolent means, meaning the ballot. Like this was his argument. And even in 64, when he gave his speech, you know, the ballot or the bullet, you know, the reason he keeps pivoting to the bullet, because he recognizes that the large black society, right, is stuck on the ballot. So he's trying to give them education because he recognizes that they're politically mature. And even when he inserted himself into the civil rights movement, he said, you know, I just sent off a dispatch to that racist, you know, Klansman down there in Mississippi, and I let him know that I'm no longer bound by the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. So if you try to touch any of these black people that's trying to exercise their constitutional rights, I want you to know I speak the same language as you, right? This situation is going to be even Steven.
So wouldn't that be the ballot and the bullet, brother?
No. He recognized that the ballot wasn't the situation, but he realized that that's what black people was stuck at. But if he hadn't, black people's consciousness hadn't been raised to the bullet at that point, but he saw it as his duty to protect black people, right? And just to answer the question in terms of what does black power look like outside of electoral politics, it looks like Garveyism. Garvey said, I went all over this world and I asked, where's the black man's government? I did not see one. I did not see one, so I built one, right?
You had to deal with Garvey. You know Garvey was a capitalist, right?
I know Garvey, but I also put Garvey.
Capitalist.
I can also keep Garvey in his time period and in the context of where he was.
Exactly.
In terms of black power outside of this system, it looks like separation. It looks like us developing a government and waiting, because what you just said, and I resent the equating of separation with segregation. And
no, I didn't do that.
Hold on one second. You said why retreat? Why relinquish our position? And the brother Coloma mentioned he equated separation with segregation, and they're not the same thing, because like you said, this system at the federal level, and I would argue that at the state level as well, is dissolving. When it dissolves, if black people haven't formed themselves into a nationalist or a separatist entity, then we're going to be up for the taking for whoever comes and takes over after that, right? And you talk about using the state. Well, we're
not disagreeing. I'm trying to see where we're disagreeing. You're saying under no circumstances ever exercise the voting franchise, right? That would be the disagreement we have.
What I'm telling you is that exercise.
The only disagreement.
We both agree that this state is dissolving. Correct? Is that what we agree on that?
Yeah, but I think the only disagreement we have is whether or not to vote.
Okay, so we both agree that this state is dissolving. So let's look at where does that put black people in terms of, we're already in a powerless position, but in terms of vulnerability, where does that leave black people?
It's a simple question, brother.
All right, let him respond, Omawale. You kind of going on.
All right.
I don't know. I just got a simple question. And should we ever vote in any circumstance?
I'm saying no.
Okay.
I'd say no, because I think it's a practitioner of a ritual.
Okay.
So here's what
there it is.
boggles my mind, because on the one hand, we're trying to say that we are in deep opposition to white supremacy, deep opposition to corporate supremacy, but at the same time, we are leaning towards tactics that those groups did not do in order to gain the amount of power and prestige and status that they currently have. So if we were to flip this question and say, 200, 300 years ago, how do white people get white power outside of electoral politics? The answer then would have been you expand the conception of whiteness. You start convincing all these people who currently don't see themselves as white that they are then white. Certainly, to go back to this question that Malcolm raised, the ballot or the bullet, they certainly would have said, in addition to expanding the conception of whiteness, we use the bullet. We use the bullet in order to gain political power. But they also said we use the ballot, and they begin to create policy and laws that participated in that construction of whiteness. They didn't merely go around and say, hey, you all are white. They said, okay, we now have a law in the books. We now have a law enforcement agency that is going to punish people if they violate the conception of whiteness that we are now trying to push for. So to bring it back to the original question, 1 second, one of the things we might want to consider doing is looking at current conceptions of blackness to see whether or not they actually are the most conducive to getting not just black people, but all people towards the place that we think we belong.
So you
Can
know,
I jump in here? Well, go ahead, brother Mwala. Go ahead. I'll come in after you.
no, what's beautiful about what you just said is in terms of how we obtain power. Well, when you look at, let's use that analogy where the Europeans here revolted from the British Crown. They recognized that they were a colony of the Crown. One of the things that I think that we don't recognize that as Black people in America, that we are an internal colony. You know, we see ourselves as citizens. We truly think that we are Americans, and we engage in Americanism every year and every election that we vote in because we believe, right? You know, we're talking about obtaining power. What power are we talking about? Let's make it plain. We're talking about obtaining the power of the Constitution, right? Because you're trying to leverage.
No, brother.
No. What's enforcing your power if you're saying you're getting it through the state? If you're saying that you're going to invert, if you're saying you're going to invert the power of the state on its head, you're talking about the state laws, right? That's not what I'm talking about, because the reality is, right, if the most sovereign thing that you can do as an individual is protect yourself. Look back what happened in 67 out in Oakland when the Panthers tried to protect themselves and patrol their community. What did they do? They changed the law at the state level to make sure that they couldn't do that, right?
Yeah,
So,
all those black state legislators. Wait, no. Oh, go ahead.
no, I'm
Talking about rhetorical ethic.
you know, I can kind of like go on from here. Y'all get me hyped, man. So I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna let Dr. Kamal see what he needs to say.
So you
know, respond.
Yeah.
Do you want to respond? Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm gonna walk on the edge of the pond for a minute, and I want to raise a question. I think that puts this question in context, because I think a number of the points that people have raised have articulated this in some ways or another. And there's a question that makes me think about the work of a lot of people that I know. And the question is, what does revolutionary struggle look like in a proto-revolutionary condition? I think that part of what we're getting at is that, right? Because I think Brother Greg is right. Dr. Kai is right. Both the model of capitalism, this global neoliberal capitalism, is inherently unsustainable, but also the state apparatus itself is profoundly problematic, and we see that particularly when we look at the local level, the unraveling of local economies in very profound ways. So much so that various cities around the country have to prostitute themselves in the global economy for the sake of for maintaining this illusion of financial solvency. But that's perhaps a discussion for another time. So the question is, what does revolutionary struggle look like? A proto-revolutionary condition. And I say proto-revolutionary condition because I think we can be pretty clear that the masses of our people have not reached a point of political education whereby they accept, one, the inherent illegitimacy of the structure, and along with that, the necessary imperative of African self-determination, African independence is a necessary byproduct of that. And so I think that we can raise this question around this idea of how do we move from where we are to a capacity where we can ensure our own interests. And I'm arguing that as a revolutionary outcome. I think that, there are a number of arguments which captured the Brad Brown in his book, Die Nigga Die. I think he published that in '69, raised a wonderful point. He said that those who are interested in a revolutionary struggle, the most important thing that they can do is create a parallel system of institutions that counter to those of the enemy. This is what the Council of Independent Black Institutions was doing in the early 1970s with the Shule Yamatoto in Chicago and the Eastern New York and all these other schools around the country. They were creating that parallel body of institutions. Because African people have to understand that we have the capacity to educate ourselves. And we also have to create an institutional framework that is committed to us, the socialization of people who are indeed revolutionaries. And so I think that challenge is we are never removed from that challenge. That remains the work that has to be done today. And again, I'm dealing with this question of, how do we create power? And I think, again, institution building is the most effective mechanism through which we can create power outside of the electoral process, building institutions on the grassroots level. The Council of Independent Black Institutions, in fact, argues that there were 6 levels of institution building: education, food, housing, healthcare, clothing, and defense. And what I think would be the most effective way, what I think is most demonstrative of our ability to build a power base for ourselves outside of the existing milieu is to engage in that work. So with respect to that, right? So we already know that we've engaged in exhaustive efforts since the early 1970s around independent education, whether that was independent African-centered schools, or whether what you get in the 1990s is these African-centered charter schools, or what you've had as a burgeoning phenomenon since the 1990s also has been independent African-centered homeschoolers. But you also have a number of interesting things which are occurring, for instance, locally, and I'm sure this is happening out your way as well. There's some fundamental reconceptualizations of Black economics. In fact, there are a number of very audacious grassroots collectives working around this question of economic development. And one of the things that's happening parallel to that, which is intriguing, is you have people who are attempting to delink economic development from the monetized economic structure. And so you've had this interesting resurgence of barter economics, which I think poses some very interesting possibilities in terms of, again, reorienting and re-educating us in terms of how we think about economic development in our community. I think another piece which also is a site of potentiality with respect to this is this formation of regionalism, this burgeoning regionalism, which we see happening, especially in East Africa, West Africa, and the Caribbean. I'm talking about CARICOM, the East Africa Organization, ECOWAS. And again, I'm not saying that these are revolutionary organizations, but I think these are organizations who are leveraging capacity which could be utilized by those who have a Pan-African consciousness in ways which are very important. And then the last thing I'll say, the last two things is this. With respect to Pan-Africanism, because again, I think Pan-Africanism is an inextricable element of this, because I think that if we're serious about getting out of the situation, we have to think about ourselves not just as a people who are situated within the domestic milieu of the United States, but also as a global people. And so whether we're talking about ecological initiatives, whether we're talking about questions of food security, or whether we're talking about issues of resource scarcity, these are sites where there's a great deal of synergy between ourselves and different parts of this country, as well as African people around the world. And our effective organizing around these are also potential incubators of political power. The last one is this, and this is to the brother Zach's point, is this piece of this culture piece. I appreciate that he mentioned the Haitian Revolution, because we cannot ever diminish the capacity of culture to serve as an engine of power, because culture is not just about how we sing, how we dance, the language that we use, or the way that we style our hair, but it's also about engaging the political imagination, the imagination of what is possible in the minds of African people, stimulating that imagination, expanding it. And so to that end, a lot of, I mean, everything that I do, but I mean, all of us, I'm sure, engaged in culture work in this way, attempting to use our culture in a way to engage the imagination of African people. And this is being, and creating within our minds potential incubators of social power. And so whether you're talking about, you mentioned being a child of Ogun, and that made me, think about, again, some of the another pieces going on in Mississippi. A lot of people don't talk about it. It's a sister down there carrying on the work of Baba Metahochi in terms of New African Vodun. Again, what are the potential political implications of that with respect to orienting our consciousness and making a case for sovereignty, not just in the political arena, but also in the cultural arena?
And I guess I'll just sum up this question to say, I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. If you're someone who doesn't believe in voting, I'm not someone that tries to convince people to vote. But we can also understand that if people find ways that they think that they can use power, that by all means do that. To me, the more concerning thing is when I hear Black people make these blanket statements, when I hear Black people try to enforce that the Democratic Party is the only way to vote, when I hear Black people try to force people to vote even when their interests are not on the ballot. So, regardless of whether you vote or not, you should always be concerned with economic power. You should always be concerned with growing links inside of the diaspora. And, by all means, if you want to do one thing or the other, like I said, just walk and chew gum at the same time. It doesn't have to be either or, especially when we're talking about something that affects so many people. We're never going to all agree on one thing. So if anything, what we should agree on is that these hurtful mindsets that we have adopted, that we have to be this party or that party, those are the things that we should be criticizing. And instead of demonizing people for voting or not voting, we should be instead focusing on the mindset of being politically mature, as Malcolm said. So anything else before we go to the next topic?
I like to agree with you, and I just like to add the most powerful sentence that I ever heard when I first got into my graduate program from my teacher, Dr. Mazama, where she said, "Our people don't exist on our terms. We exist on borrowed European ones." And when she said that, it just cleared everything up for me. We need our own terms. When Black people get trapped between these binaries, between the Democrats and Republicans, or the Russians in the United States, or the Arabs in the United States, or, the capitalists or the socialists or the this or the that. When we don't exist on our own terms, we can't organize our own politics in a constructive fashion.
Okay, so last question. What are the steps that the Black community should take to build immediate power in the service of Black liberation? Anyone can jump in.
I'm going to say, you know, borrow from the great ancestor Kwame Ture and a little bit of Garvey. You know, first we got to organize, right? Garvey said that disorganization is the greatest weapon used against the Negro. So we have to organize our people, and it starts by organizing their consciousness, right? Because consciousness precedes unity, right? And if we're going to obtain, you know, any power, we won't get that power unless we're unified as a people. I do think that, you know, abandoning the vote or the electoral process becomes a significant, you know, measure in terms of consciousness, specifically separatist consciousness in Black America, right? Because I believe that, you know, Dr. Kamal just said, you know, as people start to see the inherent illegitimacy of this system, I think when people see the system as something that is not the rightful arbiter of power, but they themselves, the group, is the arbiter of power, I think that more and more of us will abandon this system. We will abandon voting. And in that regard, when that occurs, organizations like the ones that, you know, I'm working with, the one that you're working with, will be there with the aims, objectives, ideas to guide our people and to build a system outside of this current reality, a separate reality that can stand in opposition to the current institutions that are put in place to kill Black people, right? So I'm only concerned with our survival, and I think that, you know, continuing to participate in this system, you know, shows a bit of kind of like insanity, you know, on our part.
I don't think any tactic or any strategy should be off the table. I think that, I guess to quote Brother Omwale again, Brother Malcolm X, of all our studies, history is the one that's best prepared to reward all research. When we look at the 19th century, as I say, we look at the Reconstruction era in this country, particularly when you look at somebody like Martin Delany, you're looking at somebody who did not concede any weapon in the tool to advance our liberation. Late capitalism is revealing itself, and this system is going to dissolve. Part of what we can do and what we continue to do is to press to heighten the contradictions. Voting isn't going to save us, but not to use voting as a tool and use it strategically, to use it coming out of organized study and struggle is, I think, not just a bad tactical decision. It doesn't make any sense. It should not capture our imagination in the way that it does. I agree with that. Narrative has been a problem, as we've heard Brother Coloma say. And I agree with Dr. Mazama. You know, we need to define ourselves. Of course, now, you know, somebody who Dr. Mazama's people came up under the colonial influence of out of France, Jean-Paul Sartre. You know, I'm thinking of my teacher, Obenga, who would often say that this question of existentialism is at the center of this conversation. In other words, and for that matter, abandon Sartre, go to Fanon. We become people in direct measure to how we think other people think about us. And when we're organizing, we shouldn't be thinking about Democrats or Republicans. We should be thinking about our interests and how to advance them. From that grounding and that perspective, you know, it's difficult to study and organize when you don't have a place to stay. It's difficult to think through the next steps of revolutionary practice when you haven't had anything to eat. Now, last I checked, whether we vote or not, we're still paying taxes, whether it be sales tax or income tax. The idea that we can't heighten the contradictions of capitalism while we take some of those resources we've already been siphoned from our labor, beginning with our theft of this country, and repurpose them to help us advance our liberation and heighten the contradictions, that just flies in the face of everything we've done since we were captured. So I think that the practical step we can do is organize, study, and then make decisions that are in the best interest of the collective with every option on the table. And if we're organized and if we've studied, then those decisions will be rational, will be deeply informed, and we don't have to worry about D's or R's or reds or blues. We'll be working in the interest of African people. And that's what we see over the arc of our history. When we've done that, we've made progress.
Okay, any closing thoughts on what should happen for Black liberation to take place?
Yeah, I think, and again, I've said some things about this, but you know, in terms of what we need to do, and I think Brother Mwali captured, you know, part of what I was going to say is that we need to be engaged in organization. Far too many of us, our contribution to the Black struggle is this, you know, or this, but it actually needs to be work, you know. So for my part, you know, I'm engaged in local, this work around local food security. I'm engaged in work around community grassroots education. I do survival training. I teach African martial arts. We do self-defense training in the community. You know, we're dealing with a whole range of initiatives relative to the reclamation of African consciousness. And so I think on one hand, we need to be engaged in organization, whether it's grassroots organizing people around finite political issues, such as like here we want to elect the school board. You know, we think that we live in an anti-democratic system, and we do. And so an elected school board may be a matter to add a modicum of democracy to this veneer, you know, over this system. So this question of organizing people around issues is a role, something in which we should be doing. This capacity of engaging, and I think this is really, really important, engaging in formations that have a long-term commitment to African self-determination, I think is absolutely important. And so whether that is groups such as, you know, again, the New African Independence Movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the Council of Independent Black Institutions, again, these organizations that emerge out of the history of struggle that have not only conceptualized a particular vision of our future, but also particular methodologies which they have refined. I think that we need to be in conversation with that. And I think that we need to be active participants in that, not just as, you know, on theoretical level. I think the last thing would be, like, you know, Dr. Hart said, we need to use every tool at our disposal. You know, I'd like to think about, you know, when I teach martial arts to people, you know, we talk about improvised weapons. You know, and I think about this. I was just traveling to South Carolina a couple of days ago for a conference, and I only had a backpack. You know, so I can't take any weapon, but I could take a weapon. I had this in my pocket, and I could do a lot of damage with it. You know, and not just writing. I could do some real damage with it. And so again, we need to use every weapon at our disposal. I think the electoral political system is a weapon, and we need to use that weapon. But we have to create a type of consciousness which facilitates that. And maybe this is the last thing, is that we have to be engaged in this process of reorienting the consciousness of our people. And again, to end, we have to use every tool. So just real quick, I mean, like I mentioned, this is before we got on. My wife is an urban farmer. We don't see this as just about growing cabbages and growing Swiss chard and you know, and people getting nutritious food. We see this as a way of reorienting Africans' relationship with the food economy, reorienting Africans' relationship with around this question of self-determination, because the people who are desirous of freedom must be concerned, among other things, with their capacity to feed themselves. And so we see this as something which we can use around politicizing people with a nationalist consciousness. The last thing is a capoeira. I don't teach a capoeira because you know, for the kicking and punching. It's if it was just about martial arts, I'd just keep doing kung fu. I teach capoeira because African people need to understand that we have tools which are available to us, which can facilitate the ends of transforming ourselves as well as our community in terms of addressing structural needs. And so for me, you know, it's not just about teaching people how to do cartwheels and how to do kicks. It's about giving people a mooring in what it means to be African in the world, in a particular cultural tradition which emerged from African resistance to tyranny. And so again, we have to be using every tool that we have at our disposal to politicize that consciousness. And once the people's consciousness is politicized, it will make conversations like these less relevant, because the people themselves will use whatever tools are at their disposal. That's true. To facilitate their freedom. Some may choose to vote. Some may choose to engage in grassroots organizing. Some may choose to engage in immigration. Some may choose to engage in struggle on a higher level. But the point is that political education is absolutely imperative to sustaining this type of struggle beyond even our lifetime and our vision of what is possible.
I heard consciousness come up a bit in those last remarks, so I'll start there and say that you know, shifting how people see themselves, shifting how people see other people, shifting how people see the relationship between themselves and other people is a form of self-empowerment, and it is a form of shifting power. And so I think one thing that we can do is to be intentional and clear that when we say Black power or their calls for Black liberation, that we are not making the same calls for white power and white liberation. I know that's probably understood in this particular forum, But as we're engaging other communities who aren't as steeped in this knowledge, it's critical that we are explaining that calls for Black power, calls for Black liberation does have a different conceptual starting point than some of those other histories that they're familiar with. And so I'm thinking about Fannie Lou Hamer, who went around reminding white people, same Fannie Lou Hamer who was undoubtedly committed to increasing Black power. She went around to white people and she was telling them, your liberation is tied to our liberation. And that wasn't respectability politics. That wasn't, I'm a tool of the Democratic Party. For me, that was, I'm speaking to a consciousness that existed prior to this pre-European-led transatlantic slave project, and I'm trying to then connect you to that. And all of us are well equipped to do that and to be intentional when we say Black power, Black liberation. It goes way beyond the histories of the last 200, 300 years.
Jeffrey, you want to say something?
You still there?
I agree with Dr. Carr and Dr. Kamal Rashid. I don't know if we're in the right now to put like the core. I think we need to use all tools and empower ourselves. You know, very neoliberal time. So, you know, reject and things where we got a this period. I am influenced by Marcus Garvey and stuff, and I think that politics does have a time and place, but this time, this is not the time and place for it. And we really have to, like, you know, if we look at Garvey, we have to at least look at what he did first, and that was, you know, creation of institutions and mutual aid societies and things like that. I think when we do that first, then people might be able to listen to, like, you know, us rejecting the electoral system. But, you know, we don't have that level of institutional or industrial capacity right now. So we have to do that first.
Okay, go ahead, Alma Waller.
Yeah, man, I just want to say, you know, I don't want people to think that, like, I'm just being, you know, rigid or contrarian or, you know, bullheaded. And the reality is, you know, I truly am concerned with the survival, you know, of our people. And in that regard, I think that we fall into a trap when we have faith in the status quo, meaning we believe that this system, you know, as it exists right now today, will continue to exist, you know, tomorrow, next week, you know, and for me, this, you know, writing is on the wall, you know, so when we're talking about, you know, the survival of African people, no matter where they are, I want to read a quote from Stokely Carmichael. He was speaking at a rally for Huey Newton in '68, and he spoke directly on the vote. And we know that Stokely Carmichael was somebody who engaged heavily through SNCC to obtain the vote, obtain the ballot. But in '68, when the question was the question of Black survival, when they saw that this society was really looking to eliminate its Black population, you know, Stokely Carmichael's response was, you know, they got this new thing now, you know, Black power is the vote. It says the vote in this country is, has been, and always will be irrelevant to the lives of Black people. And that's a fact. You know, that's a direct quote from Stokely Carmichael, somebody who organized to get the ballot for Black people. I know that he is someone who has changed his positions over time. But what I'm just trying to explain to us is when it comes to survival of our race, of the Black race here in America, voting truly ain't it. And we need to be about obtaining true power. And you don't get that without separation. That's it.
All right, so it looks like we're done. Thank you, all the panelists, for giving your perspectives, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you, sis.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for tuning in. So guys, if you want to like and comment and give your perspectives on what you thought, who do you think was right, who do you think was wrong, and hopefully we provided some helpful insights. So you all have a great and blessed night.
You too,
sis.
Thank you.
Peace. Hotel.